thorn in the flesh in chapter 12, and the fact that God didn't remove whatever that thorn was after seeking God 3 times, that it would depart from him. The Lord, in verse 9, another one of my favorite scriptures says, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And after Paul heard that, he says, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. This is one of the kind of the revelatory scriptures in the Bible for me. This is definitely a verse where God has spoken to me in my own personal life. We have a fear as men, of showing weakness or becoming weak, just all those insecurities. But what the Lord showed Paul is, look, I'm allowing you to experience weakness because I want the world to see that it's not you that's doing the work. It's not you that should receive the glory. It's me, and I can only be strong in those who are willing to be weak. Wow. So let that sink in. So, like I said, there's just so many just nuggets, beautiful nuggets throughout this wonderful book of 2 Corinthians. Sprinkled throughout 2 Corinthians, there's also a lot of personal references, probably more personal references in 2 Corinthians than any other book of the Bible. So we learn a lot about, and about, things in his life that we really didn't know anywhere else. For example, it's because of 2 Corinthians that we know that when Paul was in Damascus and being sought of by the Jewish hierarchy after he had converted to Christianity and kind of gone to the Christian side, they escaped from Damascus in a basket, being let down over the wall. Wow. 2 Corinthians 11, 32 and 33. So we learned that. His experience of being stoned, we know about that, that he's beaten and stoned a few times. We know that from the book of Acts, but in 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 4, he tells us of an experience of being caught up into the third heaven. No doubt a near-death experience, or perhaps he did die and was being caught up to heaven and shown things which he says are not lawful for a man to speak about. Wow. He shares his heart when he talks about his thorn in the flesh, although he doesn't tell us what it is. I'm sure the Corinthians knew what it was. And so there's several of these kind of passages in chapter 11. He speaks of himself as being not particularly eloquent in speech. Now, I don't know if that's him just being humble, but he says, but though I be rude, verse 6 of chapter 11, rude in speech, or untrained or unskilled, yet not in knowledge, but we have been thoroughly made manifest among you in all things. So that's something that we really don't read about anywhere else. And another interesting little tidbit, in chapter 10, it appears that Paul might have been short in stature, or maybe just not maybe not particularly healthy looking in stature. because he speaks of what his accusers say. His letters are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech contemptible. So maybe Paul was, maybe suffering physically, no doubt, because of his beatings. He might have had a limp and other deformities that he'd suffered out of the gospel of Jesus Christ. There are a number of leadership messages throughout, kind of sprinkled throughout 2 Corinthians. Paul emphasizes that ministers should deliver comfort and deliverance in chapter 1, be agents of forgiveness in chapter 2, operate in the Spirit, chapter 3, be example of in their life and faith in chapter 4, chapter 5. We already talked about reconciliation. Ministers should approve the ministries of be instruments of approval and encouragement to others in chapter 6. Again, agents of restoration in chapter 7. Examples in giving in chapters 8 and 9. Personally meek yet bold, chapter 10, in suffering, chapter 11, in humility, chapter 12, and discipline, chapter 13. So perhaps that's some of your best structure for the book is just just all the lessons about how Christians and Christian servants should live their lives. Another interesting teaching, and another interesting fact about 2 Corinthians is the probably more than any other book in the New Testament, the 2 Corinthians really has a lot of teaching about giving. In chapter 8, he mentions the churches of Macedonia, how that while they were going through a great trial and were in poverty, yet they gave liberally. And so that's an interesting observation. They gave beyond their ability in verse 12 of chapter 8. Chapter 8, we read about actually verse 3. They gave above their power, beyond their ability. In verse 12, it says, "If there first be a willing mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to what he hath not." In verse 8, he talks about giving ourselves first to the Lord. So your first act of giving ought to be to give of yourself. In verse 8, chapter 8, verse 7, he says, "As ye abound in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge and diligence, see also that you abound in this grace," meaning the grace of giving. Wow. So just a lot of teaching about giving in chapters 8 and 9. Verse 9 of chapter 8, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. So the example is Jesus made himself poor that we might be spiritually rich. In chapter 9, there's more on this topic of giving. In fact, we could just probably read beginning in verse 6. Wrong chapter. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. So there's that, that theme just continues on really through verses 10 and 11. So once again, just lots of great passages throughout 2 Corinthians, just sprinkled here and there. Another interesting aspect of 2 Corinthians is that there's actually a lot of teachings about the person and ministry, if you want to call it that, of Satan that are mentioned in 2 Corinthians. In chapter 4, verse 4, we learn that Satan is the god of this world, God little g, who blinds the eyes of them who don't believe in him. In 11:3, he's a serpent. In 11:14, he's an angel of light, seen as the angel of light. In 2, 10, and 11, he's the adversary who's trying to keep people from doing right. In 11:3, he's one that seeks to corrupt people's minds. And again in 11:4, 2 he's blinding the mind of those who don't believe. And in chapter 10, Paul talks about spiritual. He brings up the subject of spiritual warfare. So let's go there as we conclude chapter 10, verse 3. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ, and having in a readiness to avenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. So lots of great stuff in this book of 2 Corinthians. I hope that this has whetted your appetite to dig into this book, this great book of the Bible. And we look forward to being back with you, Lord willing, same time next week. Yes, Brother Michael. Well, you are welcome, my